Knowing how to use the pawns effectively is one of the hallmarks of a really strong chess player. And in this video, I'm going to share 5 pawn structure rules that you can use to improve your pawn play. Rule number 1 is to target weak pawns. Now, a weak pawn is a pawn which is backward or doubled, or as in this game, isolated. Black has got an isolated D pawn in the game Khan versus Bondarevsky, 1937. The D pawn of Black's is isolated because there's no black pawns on the C file or on the E file, and because of this, Black can't defend the D pawn with another one of their own pawns, and instead needs to defend this pawn with their pieces. So at the moment, the knight and the rook are responsible for guarding this weak pawn. Let's see how White played from here to add more pressure to it. Well, it started with rook to D3. The idea of this is to bring the other rook to D1, adding more pressure. So Black saw what was coming, played rook to D7 with the idea of playing rook to D8. And now after rook to D1 and rook to D8 from Black, we can see the situation here. This pawn is adequately defended. White's got 3 attackers on it, the 2 rooks and the knight, and Black has got 3 defenders on it as well, both rooks and the knight. But the difference is that White has got the threat and Black has got to go passive in defense. This means that White's got the option always of releasing that pressure. Like White can, if they want to, move their rooks away or move the knight away somewhere else. But Black can't do the same. Black doesn't have that luxury. If Black ever moves the knight or either of the rooks away, then this pawn is going to be lost. So White's got the option. White's got the maneuverability. We'll play through a few more moves of the game to see what happened next, because it's pretty interesting. This pawn on d5 isn't under immediate threat of capture because it's adequately defended, as we said. But as White looked to maneuver, eventually Black played the move f6. Now the idea of this is to bring the knight from h6, which was out of the game, back into the game via f7. But that move, moving the pawn from f7 to f6, opened up the e6 square for White. Let's see how that played out. Eventually, knight on d to e6 was played. Now that attacks the rook, and if the rook moves away, let's say here, well, then White can trade and then win the pawn. So what Black did instead was look to counterattack, which is often good practice in chess, meet the threat with another threat, knight to e5, so now both players are attacking each other's rooks, and after the trades, we can see now that the opportunity for White appeared via the move knight to c5. Now, what this does is it actually attacks one of the other pawns, not the d pawn. It was the d pawn that White added pressure to, but the pawn that actually got captured is the b pawn. So now there's no good way for Black to defend this pawn on b7. You can't play rook to d7 because that would just result in the rook getting lost, and likewise with rook to b8. Bishop takes b8 in that case. So White was able to win the b7 pawn and went on to win the game. But really it all started with adding pressure to the weak pawn. Rook to d3 followed by rook to d1 meant that Black was tied down to passive defense, and eventually White was able to win a pawn all the same. If you enjoyed that example, then you'll love what's coming up next. But before we move on, if you're not already subscribed to the channel, go ahead and click the subscribe button. I've got a ton of instructive chess content in the pipeline, all designed to make you a better player and help enjoy the game more. Rule number 2 is that weak pawns tend to become weaker as more pieces are traded from the board. Now in Califman versus Adams 1990, it's Black who's got the pressure on a weak white pawn. This knight on a4 is targeting the white pawn on b2. Now, it's defended for the moment by the queen, but at this point, White made a positional mistake by playing queen to b4, offering the queen trade. Now, if we follow the rule that I just introduced, the more pieces that are traded is going to favour the side with the pressure on the weak pawn. So that's Black. Black's got the pressure on the weak white pawn, so Black was very happy to trade queens. Now, it would of course be a mistake to capture this pawn on b2 immediately, because then White would win a pawn of their own, and Black hasn't gained anything out of that deal. It's just been an exchange of pieces and pawns. No, black is looking to win this pawn, and black was able to do this by playing rook f to b8. Now this is strong on many counts. For one thing, it activates the only piece of black's which wasn't playing a useful role. For a second thing, it looks to trade off white's most active piece, the rook on b4. And for a third thing, it looks to win material. So if white avoids the trade with rook to c4, well then the pawn is lost straight away. Whereas if, as happened in the game, white initiates the trade, well now that active white rook is gone, and this pawn is under threat, and the only way to try to save it is with rook to b1, a very passive move. This is what was played in the game. But now black can look to play rook to c8 with the idea of rook to c2 to win this pawn outright. White tried to counterattack with bishop to h3, attacking this pawn, but black just spent a move to defend that securely, and then brought the rook to c2, and pretty soon this pawn was lost, and black went on to win. Now I think it's illustrative there. It's really back in the original position because of the queen trade that black was so easily able to win this pawn. If in the original position white had instead retreated the queen with queen to c1, well then black would have had some more work to do to try to win this weak pawn. It was the positional mistake of going for the queen trade that made life very easy for black. Rule number 3 is to rid yourself of your own pawn weaknesses. Now we saw in the last couple of positions just how much of a liability that weak pawns can be. So if you've got weak pawns within your position and you have the chance to trade them off, then it's usually a great idea to do it. Now a great example of this actually occurred in one of my own games. This is a game that I played online in 2022. Now I've got the black pieces here, and if we do a material count, we can see that black has got the extra exchange. White's got a knight, and black has got a second rook. So what are we taught to do when we have extra material? Well, as a rule of thumb, we're taught to simplify the game. Trade pieces, right? And that's exactly what I looked to do here. I played the move queen to e6, offering the queen trade. Now, white actually initiated the queen trade, which I was surprised by and happy to see, until white played the move knight to g5. And now all of a sudden, the bishop and the knight are targeting two of my weak pawns here. According to the engine, it's still very slightly better for black, but this is not at all easy to play, and I went on to lose this game. So what should have I done instead, back in the original position? Well, I think if I'd been following this rule and been thinking in the right way, then I would have found the right plan. So what's my weakest pawn here? Well, it's the pawn on c6. It's isolated, and it's also very easy for white to target it, with moves like rook to c1. Also, the light-squared bishop naturally points at this pawn. So this is my weak pawn, and I could have traded it off with the move c5. And now white can't prevent that pawn from being traded. He can't capture, because then he'll lose the rook in the corner. He can't capture with the queen either, for the same reason. I initiate the trade, and then the rook on a1 falls. So what would probably happen if I were to have played that move? White would play something like rook to c1 probably, just getting the rook off that diagonal. And then I can trade on d4, white would take back, and now I can trade queens. And it's different because now I don't have that weak pawn on c6 anymore. It's a definite improvement here. And in addition, we've now got 3 open files, which rooks love. Rooks love open files. So I'd be able to bring my rooks to the b file, to the c file, and probably go on to have a very comfortable victory, I'd be guessing. But it comes from understanding that the thing to do is to trade off this weak pawn first, and this is in priority to trading queens. I mean, chess is a complex game. Sometimes the rules of thumb that we're taught contradict each other. I mean, do you trade queens when you're up material, or do you trade your weakest pawn first? It all depends on the position, of course, but if you have this idea in mind that you don't have to automatically trade queens all the time and that there's sometimes other priorities to look for, then that can lead you to the right plan, and the right plan can lead you to the right moves. Now that last game was a very instructive one for me on my own journey to achieving a score of over 2,000 on chess.com Rapid. And now I'm helping ambitious adults reach the results in chess that they dream about. So if you'd like to explore working with me, if you enjoy my teaching style, then click the link in the description below. We can set up a time to chat. I can tell you all about the Road to 2000 Chess Improvement Program, and we can see if it's a good fit for you and your chess goals. Lesson 4 is to prevent your opponent's intended pawn breaks. This is good advice in any type of position, actually, to just understand what your opponent wants and then try and prevent it if you can. Now, our model game here is Bogolyubov versus Capablanca, 1924. And White's weakest pawn is the c3 pawn. White wants to be able to play the pawn from c3 to c4 to trade it off, and Black, therefore, wants to prevent this. Let's see how Capablanca did it. Well, he started with a plan that we saw earlier in this video, with rook to c7, just looking to double rooks on the c file. White brought his rook over to c1, and here we go, rook to c8. So White is unable to play the c4 advance. If c4 were played, then it would just get captured. And after all the trades, Black just has too many attackers on that square. So White tried to arrange things to eventually play the c4 advance, but then Black prevented it again with knight to d6. So once again, it's a situation where White has to be passive in order to defend this pawn, and this can create new opportunities. Let's see what happened. Well, more pressure on the pawn, making sure that it can't move under any circumstances. And after a bit of maneuvering, we saw that it was a different pawn that actually ended up getting lost. This is so often the way. You put pressure on one area of the board, and then the opportunity presents itself in another area of the board. But it really all began with understanding what White wanted. White wanted to push the pawn from c3 to c4. Black looked to prevent that, and after all these moves, White was just unable to play the move that he wanted to play. A very frustrating state of affairs, and that is often the circumstances where mistakes can come, and as I mentioned before, where opportunities can arise in different areas of the board. Rule number 5 is to look to transform the pawn structure in ways that help activate your pieces. To illustrate this, we've got a key moment from the game Bronstein versus Botvinnik, 1951. Actually, this is one of the games that comprised the 1951 World Chess Championship. So White to move, and White played a takes b5. Now, if Black were to recapture with the rook or with the c-pawn, well then the a-pawn would just be lost. So understandably, Black took back with the a-pawn, but now White is able to activate their pieces thanks to this transformation in the pawn structure via rook to a7. So now White has got a rook to the 7th rank, which means that Black's life quickly becomes very difficult. As we cycle through the next few moves and get to another key moment here, we can see that just a move ago, after bishop to h4, the Black rook is attacked, and if Black were to trade rooks here, well then White has another rook to get to the 7th rank to replace it with, so it doesn't really help. So in the game instead, Black decided to give up the exchange, taking off this strongly placed knight. Other moves are not any better here. And after these captures, you can see that every move that White is making is creating a threat. Now the queen is attacked. The queen tries to move away, but now the bishop is attacked. If the bishop takes, well then after queen to b2 check, it's just lights out for Black. You can block for one move, but it doesn't really help. We can block for one more move, but then everything just falls with checkmate. So what happened in the game instead was, after this, Black retreated the bishop, but then White simply traded queens, and there was a resignation. But if Black had continued the game, then the rook on b8 would fall, and yeah, White has just up far too much material. But You can just see how quickly black's game collapsed after white was able to get a rook to the 7th rank. How was white able to get a rook to the 7th rank? Well, he was able to get a rook to the 7th rank by making this change in the pawn structure. That allowed the rook invasion, and that's what made black's life so tough and secured white the victory. Now that you've learnt these important lessons about pawn play, click here to learn all about attacking chess. Because what tends to happen is that if you can outplay your opponent with superior pawn play and superior piece play, then the attacking opportunities will present themselves. So check out this video and learn how to finish the game off strongly.